In July of 1944, as the Allied invasion of France still hung in the balance, the Canadian Army was given a new mission in Normandy: advance and capture Verrières Ridge. Hidden on the ridge, lying in wait for Canada's volunteer divisions, was the cream of the German Army. One of Canada's most renowned regiments, Montreal's Black Watch, would spearhead the attack. At a Canadian Army base, today's Black Watch soldiers relived their regiment's darkest hours in the Second World War.
For loving God, there's something wrong. There's no covering artillery fire. Never in all the rehearsals in England did we ever attack like this.
Their approach was spotted by the Germans.
We noticed a body of infantry, about 300 to 400 men, advance south. This was most impressive and perplexing. The soldiers were marching upright, holding rifles across their breasts in readiness as if on parade drill.
The tragedy that unfolded in this field is only one of the cataclysms that befell the Canadian Army in Normandy in the summer of 1944. The true story of those battles has never really been told. Canada sent some of its best artists to paint the war, but their canvases, $500 million worth, are in a war museum warehouse with no money to display them. In a sense, the artists were the only ones allowed to record the truth.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from France. Here she goes.
The country's best reporters were at the front right behind the generals, but they were sworn into the army and their dispatches censored. After the war, some admitted they were cheerleaders for a cause, not journalists at all. With the help of today's army, this is an account of Canada's crucial and controversial role in those desperate battles, battles that changed the course of history, battles that still echo today. In Normandy, Radley Walters was among the best, a shrewd and unflappable young tank officer who became a legend for the way he outfoxed superior German panzers. For him, the Battle of Normandy was a struggle against German tank regiments that had far better equipment, superior training, and more experience. He wants to pass on the lessons of Normandy to today's army, while he still has the chance.
It really comes back on our own shoulders that before they put us 6 feet into the ground, that somebody should sit down and each one of us at least pass on to the generation that's going to follow some of the lessons which we learned.
Radley Walters was 20 when he left the Gaspé Peninsula to train for war. The son of a small-town minister, he thought he was embarking on a great adventure. Jacques Dextraz was only 19 when he joined the army as a private soldier, rising swiftly through the ranks in the years leading to Normandy. In Normandy, he commanded a company. By the end of the war, his regiment. By the 1970s, the entire Canadian Army as Chief of Defense Staff. He remembers the controversy between French and English Canadians about whether to go to war. For him, there was no question.
And I could see that this guy Hitler was going all over Europe. And I was very deeply affected when I saw what was happening to France. And not that I joined up, to defend French-speaking Canadians or English-speaking Canadians. I joined up to defend Canada.
For many Canadians, patriotism and adventure were not on their minds when they decided to join the Army. It was the Depression. There was no work, little food, and the Army represented a steady paycheck. Joseph Le Boutelier joined New Brunswick's North Shore Regiment.
I figured the Army would feed and clothe me. They paid $25 a month. I was making maybe $5 before that. It was the only choice. It had nothing to do with patriotism.
The Canadian Army had been a fearsome force in the First World War, but in the following decades it had been allowed to run down. It had dwindled to 5,000 men. The Army had been assigned mostly to local police actions, aid to the civil power. General Guy Simonds became a key commander of Canadians in Europe. He earned his spurs in civil actions before the war. His troops were used as strikebreakers in Nova Scotia.
The strikers greeted our cavalry patrols with jeers and stones. Well, I was playing on the regimental soccer team and got the idea of challenging them to a series of matches. It was great fun. Soon they stopped stoning our patrols, and when the strike ended, the miners and their families lined the streets of Sydney and cheered us on our way.
With the declaration of war, the Army was increased 100-fold, but training was mostly casual and haphazard. At first, it was geared to refighting the First World War. Even when the process got more sophisticated, the men often weren't required to take it terribly seriously. When the Canadians arrived in England, their fine reputation from the First World War had preceded them. They still looked smart on the parade square. Time magazine described them as a dagger pointed at the heart of Berlin. To experienced military men, though, it was quickly apparent that the Canadian Army was badly trained and poorly led. The plain-speaking Allied commander, Bernard Montgomery, had little use for most Canadian generals, sometimes describing them as full of gallantry without brains or common sense. Montgomery called Canada's senior commander, Andrew McNaughton, a brilliant military scientist, but inept as a general. After much controversy, McNaughton removed himself from command. Arriving to replace him was another general with suspect battlefield credentials. Harry Crerar was a savvy military politician, a survivor. He was promoted despite helping organize both Hong Kong and Dieppe, two of Canada's worst military disasters. Montgomery said, "Harry thinks himself a great soldier. He took command at noon, made his first mistake at 12:05, the second after lunch." The only Canadian general Montgomery had any time for was Guy Simonds. Monty had watched Simonds lead a Canadian division fighting in Italy and thought he showed promise. Simonds became a Monty protege. Guy Simonds was born in Britain to an upper-class family, one factor that contributed to his popularity with the British. Simonds was less popular with Canadians. His superior tried to have him fired, and his men often found him arrogant and overbearing. Brigadier Harry Foster served under Simonds.
Simonds sets high standards. It's impossible to satisfy. I tried to talk to him after he ran roughshod over two of my senior officers. He said, "Somebody had to talk to them, Harry. I did because you didn't." Unfortunately, he doesn't have time for poor old Harry Crerar either.
As the date approached for the greatest military confrontation in history, the infighting of the Canadian generals, added to the lack of proper training for Canadian troops, did not augur well. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The CBC's Matthew Halton reports that the invasion of Europe is underway.
The weather didn't look too good, but then the word came to go, and the greatest armadas ever seen steamed out toward France.
After 4 years in England, the Canadians were anxious to get going.
I can feel the tension coiled inside everyone, like an electrical charge waiting to explode.
It was the moment for the assault troops to go ashore.
In the First World War, soldiers who refused to go over the top were executed on the spot by battle police. Here, some Canadians were ordered to be just as ruthless. Acadian Corporal Joseph Lebouthillier.
We come to the landing. I got the order from my officer to come last man off the boat. He says if anyone refuse, you shoot him. But they all jumped off.
Thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers hit the beaches and began the deadliest run of their lives. According to the war correspondence version, Canadian soldiers sneered at the German resistance.
I've come back to tell you how those superb British and Canadian assault troops went almost contemptuously through minefields and curtains of machine gun fire to clear the beaches, rush the pillboxes, and kill the Germans with the bayonet.
Both journalists and generals created the myth that resistance to the landings was easily overcome. In fact, the casualties were heavy. There were 9,000 Allied casualties on D-Day. Almost 1,100 were Canadian.
Instead of coming in and swimming ashore,
By the time Radley Walters landed with his tanks in the second wave, the German resistance had been silenced by the infantry.
when you looked at that tremendous wall there and how in the hell those poor infantrymen got over it, and this gun out here was knocked out by that combination of cooperation between the tanks and the infantry.
But the approach to this gun was strewn with the bodies of Ontario's Queen's Own rifles. Half the regiment lay wounded or dead.
The Queen's Own, there were a number of lads, of course, with blankets covering them. Then they had brought the bodies together in various spots along here. And then along the sitting down on their haunches were, it must have been 3 or 4 groups of German prisoners. And those were the first Germans that I had.
Before us lay the naked bodies of over 100 German soldiers. Their hands tied with wire, horribly slaughtered. The officers were mutilated and in pieces.
Meyer was now commanding the lead units of one of Germany's most famous divisions, the 12th SS Hitler Youth. They were all born in 1926. Supposed incarnations of Hitler's master race. When they started training in 1943, they were all only 16 or 17. Their commander was proud of them.
They are so young. I tell them no smoking, no drinking, and no brothels. Platoon leaders are like older brothers. Training is realistic, war conditions, live ammunition. The casualties that result have to be accepted. For the motto, I gave them, I am nothing. We are everything. In all my years of fighting, I never had a troop as good as this one.
The Germans also had far superior equipment, like the 56-ton Tiger tank, more than twice the size of the main Allied battle tank. The German panzers were headed for this position, a medieval monastery called the Abbey Ardennes. Here, Kurt Meyer established an observation post and his headquarters, giving the Germans a clear view of the Allied landing and the Canadian brigade.
From the Abbey, I could see the coast and motorized columns heading towards us. My trap was set. I intended to slice through this brigade like a knife through a melon. My objective, the beaches. After our 3 years in Russia, these Canadians were to us kleine Fische, little fish. I give the order to open fire.
The teenagers of the Hitler Youth calmly set out for the Canadian position. When he saw them coming, Radley Walter's heart started pounding.
It's, I think, a little bit like a hockey game. Once you sort of drop the puck and get going, then you're all interested in what you're doing, and consequently, that little bit of fear sort of goes away from you. But there's no question when you're fired at first, I think everybody has a sense of fear.
The battle began with the German mortar barrage. Lethal bombs projected as far as 6 kilometers into the Canadian position. The Germans also had Nebelwerfers, rockets equipped with a siren designed to terrorize as well as kill. The fog of war soon enveloped the battlefield, no one quite sure who had the upper hand.
It's very confused fighting. Communications go out between the infantry and the tanks. We hear of company of 100 men being overrun in Frankiville. We don't hear anything more from our reconnaissance troop, and it gets wiped out.
The first tank battles were hopelessly one-sided. The Germans could easily pick off Canadian tanks at a range of 3 kilometers. The Allies' main battle tank, the Sherman, equipped with thin armor and a weak gun, was just no match for the German panzers. The Canadian units which first encountered the 12th SS took heavy casualties.
There's nothing you can do when a man gets wounded. You have the order not to stop. The only thing we do is stick a rifle in the ground, put a helmet on top so the tanks can see and not run over him. And then the stretcher bearer comes.
There was very little information of whether anybody had survived or how many had survived. And I don't think, you know, you went around wringing your hands and you were terribly sad about all of this, as I can remember just preparing to make sure that, by God, they weren't going to go any further back. And I remember Charlie Petch, who was commanding the North Novas, and Mel Gordon, who was commanding us, said, "Okay, gang, we're going to hold here." And I think that sort of inspired us all, and it got us all together, and we said, by God, we are going to hold. Nobody's going to pass through here. And they didn't.
In defense, the Canadian infantry proved as stubbornly ferocious as the Germans, especially once they were able to bring their artillery to bear. In Normandy, artillery was the most lethal weapon on both sides, causing 3 out of every 4 wounds.
My cousin, Hassan Cormier, got hit. Shell cut his leg off. He dragged himself about half a mile, but he bled to death. There was nobody around.
Many regiments suffered grievously stopping the 12th SS. The Chaudières, the Winnipeg Rifles, the North Shore Regiment, the Regina Rifles. Boys like Gordon Branton from Lethbridge, Alberta, who lies in this cemetery beside his brother, Ronald. Their markers both read, "We left with a jest our home in the West. Now here with the best, we lie at rest." Most of the Canadians in this cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer died fighting, but there are also some who had been captured by the Germans and then died mysteriously. On the other side of the battlefield, the exhausted but still cocky members of the 12th SS had also captured some Canadian prisoners to take back to their headquarters. The Canadians were brought here to the Abbey Ardennes. The story of what happened to prisoners of war on both sides in this battle is one of the darkest chapters in the Second World War. The rules of war are very clear. Canadian Jacques Dextraz was constantly on guard against what his own men might do.
I used to tell my men, your job is to kill the enemy. That's your principal job. But the minute an enemy comes out with his hands up in the air, you must respect him, and you must protect him, and you must ensure that this man is as protected as your own man.
at the Abbey Ardennes on June 8, 1944. Those were also the rules binding the soldiers and officers of the Hitler Youth Division. Here, North Nova Scotia Highlanders and other captured Canadians were interrogated before a German newsreel camera to show how reasonably they were treated. On that summer afternoon, as the Canadians were taken away, the Abbey was a busy place. Regimental Commander Kurt Meyer was preoccupied with the battle. There is still bitter controversy regarding who issued the orders about Canadian prisoners. In the early evening on June 8th, 18 Canadians were taken through this door, one at a time. Through the courtyard, German escorts marched the Canadians, telling them they were being taken for further questioning. They went up these steps into the Abbey's garden, a fragrant apple orchard that would seem familiar to the men who came from Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley and the eastern townships of Quebec. The Abbey Garden is still owned by the Vico family. Jacques Vico knows what happened to each Canadian soldier brought here on the 8th of June, 1944, and is able to relive that day in detail for the visiting Canadians. His story begins with an account of the interrogation of a young officer from Radley Walter's tank regiment, Lieutenant Windsor.
Le lieutenant Windsor, il appartenait à votre régiment, les Sherbrooke Fusiliers.
Yes.
Et il y a un jeune capitaine allemand qui parle anglais couramment.
A young German captain who spoke fluent English asked Windsor to reveal Canadian battle plans, but Windsor would only give his name, rank, and serial number.
Mon grade, mon numéro matricule, c'est tout.
Lieutenant Windsor was then punched right in the face. Other Canadians were brought here, and they were allowed to shake hands one last time.
Ils se sont serrés la main dans un dernier geste d'amitié, et ils ont été abattus les uns après les autres.
Then they were shot one after the other.
Doucette, c'est un Indien.
Next was Doucette, a Canadian Indian who was treated in a racist way by the Germans, and then shot for no apparent reason.
On ne sait pas pourquoi. Le caporal Pollard, c'est un garçon qui a triché sur son identité. Il s'est vieilli.
Then Corporal Pollard, a boy of only 15 who lied about his age to join the army, murdered in this garden at the age of 18. The Vicos say the Germans searched the bodies of the murdered Canadians looking for cigarettes. The SS officers then washed the blood from their hands, like Pontius Pilate.
Se laver les mains comme Pilate.
Oui.
A shrine was established by the Vico family in honor of the 18 murdered Canadians. Their memory is still kept fresh here. At least 134 Canadian soldiers were executed by the SS in Normandy. The German side of this story is different. The Germans say they were often retaliating. They say Allied soldiers, including Canadians, often did not respect the Geneva Convention when they captured Germans. Kurt Meyer claimed to have evidence.
On the 7th of June, I was given a notebook taken from the body of a dead Canadian captain. In addition to handwritten orders, the note stated that no prisoners were to be taken. Some Canadian prisoners were asked to verify these instructions. They confirmed orders that if prisoners impeded the advance, they were not to be taken.
Some Canadian generals did give orders to take no prisoners, and there are many reports of such incidents occurring. One story comes from the day of the landings on the Normandy beach. A British sailor claimed he watched Canadians march some of their German prisoners behind a sand dune, hoping to get a helmet as a souvenir. Edward Ashworth followed them.
The man's throat was cut. Every one of them had his throat cut. I turned away sick as a parrot. I didn't get my tin hat.
Years later, Jacques Dextraz is ready to admit that there were similar incidents even under his command.
We cross a river, the bridge has been blown up. Take the little city by the rear. 85 prisoners we take. I select an officer, take them back to the PW cage. He goes back, making them run to the bridge that a farmer's bridge that we had come over, you know. These guys had been running for a couple of miles, you know. They came to the bridge and said, no, you don't take the bridge, you swim. Now, these guys fell and went into that water, you know, and most of them drowned. Imagine having run, you know, they had been fighting before, running, you know, for a couple of miles and being at the end and in the water, you know. Now, they were picked up by the engineers rebuilding the bridge. I could have been accused of not having protected. I'm responsible for these prisoners, you see. I felt very bad when I saw them all piled up beside the bridge site, you know. I didn't like that very much.
While the German atrocity in this garden and others like it were prosecuted, reports of Allied atrocities against Germans were never pursued. The message seems clear. War crimes committed in a good cause are politically acceptable, perhaps regrettable. But such crimes are prosecuted only on the side that loses the war. In late June 1944, it was still not clear who was going to win the Battle of Normandy. On one flank, a single German armored division held back a huge American army. In front of the Canadians and British at Caen were no less than 6 German armored divisions. The Allied military was under enormous pressure from the press and the politicians for results. To buy time, General Montgomery decided to provide a public relations victory at Caen. Despite the fact that German defense was centered outside the old Norman city, the Allies decided to boost Allied morale by leveling the place. At 9:50 p.m. on the 7th of July, 1944, 467 Allied aircraft came to destroy the city. Pre-invasion bombing had already killed 12,000 civilians in France. Hundreds more were now buried in the ruins of Caen. The CBC's Matthew Halton witnessed the attack.
It all spells death and destruction, but it's a superb and thrilling thing to see. But even after that, after the heaviest bombing of the war, some of the enemy still came up fighting. Many of them were killed or wounded.
The truth is that a search of the rubble failed to turn up a single German casualty or any German equipment. 1,000 years in the making, the medieval city was destroyed in 40 minutes. Some Canadian soldiers, like Donald Pierce of the North Nova Scotia Regiment, were horrified.
It's as though the place has been lifted bodily a mile high in the air, turned over at that point, and allowed to fall back down to earth again. We passed other shell towns and villages, all without signs of life, and wondered, ironically, if this is what they meant by liberating a town. Surely they must mean liquidating.
The leveling of Caen did not bring any military advantage to the Canadians. The German defense was still intact outside the city, and the Canadian Army still had to crack it. Canada's military historian Charles Stacey tells of his trips back to journey across the River Orne, discovering on the far side a ridge the Normans call Verrières. Remembering 1944, he wrote, "Well may the wheat and sugar beet grow lush and green upon its gentle slope, because in that half-forgotten summer, the best blood of Canada was freely poured upon it." In the shadow of Poplar, a small dirt road runs along the top of the ridge, linking places called Tilly-la-Campagne, Beauvoir, Saint-Martin, and Saint-André. Those names send a chill through the Canadian veterans who fought the SS on its heights. When Jacques Dextraz arrived here with his infantry and Bradley Walters with his tanks, they had an anticipation of a great victory. Looking back now, they think they were awfully naive.
When I was a young boy, I used to go hunting with my father. I was 7, 8, 9 years old, and I used to love hunting. And of course, I went to war. I was in my 20s, and it was just another form of hunting to me. Except that this particular deer, you know, could respond, had a gun, and so it made hunting that much more interesting.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from France. British and Canadian tank and infantry forces east of the Orne River struck southward today in a powerful and determined attack. The day is going very well.
The truth is that first attack on Verrières Ridge did not go at all well. Canada's top field general, Guy Simonds, was there.
I saw the attack go in. The first wave of armor came out in the open, and within seconds, 20 or 30 British tanks were brewing up. The attack was catastrophic.
Simonds had just arrived at Verrières Ridge to take over command of the Canadian Army from the British.
877 tanks attacked. 437 were lost. One could not help but be impressed by the camouflage and marksmanship of the German gunners, whether in tanks or manning anti-tank guns.
In one of the Canadian tanks arriving to join that same battle was Radley Walters.
And I found that the anti-tank fire and the defensive positions were getting stronger rather than getting weaker. And every time you attacked anywhere along Verrières Ridge, as a tanker, you generally came back walking.
The fact that the Germans had better equipment as well as better training placed the Allied tank corps in great jeopardy. Even 50 years later, the basic vulnerability of a tank has not changed. It's still a steel box with 5 men inside, so loaded with fuel and ammunition, it's like a bomb waiting to be ignited.
Crew, action! Time 7, ISIS on. Move on, John, course, I've loaded. Battle, double, hydraulic on. Free drivers ready. On! Troop eliminated.
In the Normandy battle, the men needed intensity and speed to ignite the enemy before he ignited you, realizing that if they didn't get the German with the first shot, they were probably going to die. The Germans called the Allied tanks Ronsons because they lit up and burned so quickly.
We had some tanks that had gasoline in them and other ones that had diesel. And we used to say that if we got hit in the diesels, we'd have maybe 14 or 15 seconds in which to crawl out through these hatches and get out. If it was a gasoline fire, you had nearly half that time, 7 or 8 seconds in which to get out. I was madly trying to force these hatches open so we could get out, and the tank was burning. And the fire was coming up through me and my hands and my hair, and of course my poor operator and gunner were getting burned too. And they weren't very big. They were small men. But I can tell you, under those particular circumstances, somehow or other, they got their shoulders against my ass. And they shoved me up, and it was my head that opened up the hatches and so on. And we all got out, and I think I ended up with something like 39 stitches in the top of my head. But when that happens, it's amazing. You just get out. There's stories of men who've had their both legs off and so on, and out through the top hatch and running on their stumps with their snatch plug broke, either holding them into the tank from their headsets,
right,
and them trying to get away from the bloody thing which was on fire.
Because the Canadians were losing so many tanks, General Simmons decided that from now on, attacks should be led by the infantry instead. As dangerous as it was to be in a tank on Verrières Ridge, an infantryman was 10 times more likely to die. Jacques Dextraz was ordered to cross this wheat field with his company of 90 men from the Fusiliers Montréal. In the first battle of their lives, the recently arrived Montreal Regiment was headed for a position strongly fortified by the Germans, a series of stone buildings across the main road called Beauvoir Farm. Now Dextraz can laugh about just how scared he was.
As a matter of fact, I was smoking my pipe, and I pulled a pack of cigarette out of my pocket and I lit the cigarette. So I'm finally smoking a pipe, having a cigarette. I threw my pack of cigarette away, which was half full. We were laying down and running, and the balance of us. And when I threw myself in the wheat, it just looks to me as if there were wasps in the field. I could hear this zzz, zzz going around. It didn't take long that I realized these weren't wasps, or they were pretty lively wasps. It was the tank that was firing at us, and it was cutting the grain, which was, of course, about that high by that time.
Without any warning, the experienced Germans welcomed the Green Canadians to the battlefield.
My friend from Caracat, Albert, he got a direct hit in the trench. And all we could find was his arm.
They had trained for this moment for 4 years. In their first 10 minutes on the battlefield, 6 out of 10 men in the Fusiliers Montréal were killed or wounded. It was a tough initiation for young Major Jacques Dextraz.
I thought I was a well-trained man for war when I landed here. Boy, I learned about fighting and learned that I didn't know much. But I learned.
As fresh soldiers approached the battlefield, they often passed the grave registration units at work not far away. It was a chilling sight. As the dead begin to pile up, it has a devastating effect on an army. Each death has a psychological impact on the men who witness it. Donald Pierce fought beside a well-loved captain from the North Nova Scotia Regiment.
A solitary German sniper put one through his stomach at 500 yards. He half staggered to a small barn and announced, "I'm hit. I think it's bad." He lay down, covered with a small blanket to keep him warm. He began to thrash and roll around in his deep musical voice, curse and swear, pounding on the barn floor with his open hands, back of his head. 4 men tried to hold him down. He fought them off, continued to roll and pound and shout for a long while there in the dust. He was a full 6 hours dying.
Watching friends and comrades die was only the beginning of the horror. The soldiers were often left to rot in the summer sun. The smell of the battlefield was overpowering, a stench so strong in the summer's heat, it often carried on the wind for miles.
An animal would bloat up and so on, and nobody would bury it, and consequently troops that were dead on the ground weren't buried in time. And we went by some Fort Garry tanks, and they had been knocked out, and the bodies were in there for, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks in this hot weather. And the absolute stink as you went by was just overpowering.
Oh, the smell. Oh, God, the smell is the worst. Dead Germans, dead cows. I dig this trench in the dark and go to sleep. The smell wakes me up. I've dug into the grave of a German.
Sometimes it gets worse. Just as a soldier learns to block his mind to losing friends, block away the stench of bodies, there were new nightmares.
We needed tanks badly. I was down to 6 or 7, and this one, the motor was still running in it. We could see where it had been hit and so on, and when night came on, I decided to get the body out, and I had to go in and cut the guy in half because rigor mortis had set in. I took a machete, and I cut him in half and took him out in 2 pieces because we couldn't get him out in 1 piece. Well, that doesn't do you very good, and I thought afterwards in doing these little tricks, not little tricks, but in doing your duty, really, that it came over me, and I decided on my own that none of the crews, nor myself, should get involved in it again.
At this point in Normandy, psychiatric collapse was skyrocketing, responsible for almost 1 of every 3 casualties.
An 88 shell bounced off our old trench. And within 1 minute, we had 3 guys go wacky. 1 an officer, a corporal, and 1 a private. The officer, God, what a big man, just broke down and cried. Had to get him out of there quick. The private jumped up out of the trench and started running circles in the field. So one of the guys tackled him, held him down, and finally got him back to the aid post.
Men breaking down with combat shock were always under suspicion. General Simmons considered them cowards, malingerers.
It requires the close attention of commanders to see that malingering is not only discouraged, but made a disgraceful offense.
In the Canadian Army, malingering was an offense punishable by 5 years of hard labor in prison. Other armies recognized shell shock for what it was, acute psychiatric collapse.
Some guys just stopped taking it. This fellow, he fell down like a dead man. We had to put him on a stretcher and carry him back. And he said nothing. He was never a man after that.
The number of casualties, both physical and psychological, were growing because the battle was getting worse. The battle was only half over, But the worst was still to come. During the summer of 1944 in Normandy, the land of William the Conqueror, Canadian soldiers were calmly fighting the battle of their lives.
That's the main road that goes straight down to Caen there.
Yeah?
And
Jacques Dextraz was leading the battle-weary troops of the Fusiliers Montréal.
All the way.
We came over here on the right, and then we finally joined up on the main road there. Came across into the city. The South Saskatchewan had been through.
Yeah, I came through the South Saskatchewan.
Radley Walters was leading tanks from the Sherbrooke Regiment.
A strike came in with a typhoon, so this whole bloody city was burning, as I recall.
The German Army of the West was fighting a brilliant and savage battle against the combined Allied force of 1 million Americans, British, and Canadians. In late July 1944, the issue was still in doubt. The soldiers who fought were only dimly aware of the grand strategy. The scenes that stay with them are small and vivid.
We came into that square. The Germans were firing at us from the old girls' school at the other end.
Right.
We were at these houses ourselves. The Germans were in this particular building there, pouring fire at us, and we at them. When all of a sudden, fire stops coming from them, and we stopped our own fire. And I looked up to see the reasons why. There was a kid that had come out of the school there, right onto the square. About 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. Its little finger in the mouth and just looking left and looking right. And all of a sudden, a woman comes out. I suppose the mother grabbed the child, put it to her chest, looked to the left, looked to the right, and ran back into the church. Really, it was quite something. And then, Second World War resumed, boy, the Germans on one side and us on the other, trying to kill each other.
A battle of such cataclysm caught the Canadian Army unprepared in Normandy. It was often calamitous for men with casual and haphazard training. The Allies were suffering far more dead and wounded than they had anticipated. In late July 1944, the Canadians started running out of trained men to use as replacements. For every 2 men dead or wounded, there was only 1 trained man to replace them. The crisis made the army ruthless. Wounded soldiers were often sent back to the front before they had any chance to recover. Joseph Le Boutelier of New Brunswick had been evacuated to England after a serious back wound.
2 weeks later, they wanted to send me back. But my back wasn't healed. I couldn't even carry my pack. So the officer says that I should go to France for 2 months of convalescence, that I'd be better off there because it was French. I believed him. I go off to France. And that very evening, I'm back with my company on the firing line.
For the rest of the war, sending wounded men back into battle was not enough. There still weren't enough trained replacements. The crisis had an immediate impact at the front for the commanders leading the fight. Brigadier Harry Foster.
Most of the men we're getting are soft. They've been trained to cook, bake, drive, type and shuffle papers. Everything but kill Germans. The problem's with the bloody politicians in Ottawa, who don't realize that in war, men are wounded and die and have to be replaced.
The shortage of good reinforcements was blamed on a conscription crisis back home. In fact, the shortage was caused by Army bungling. From the beginning, the Army had enough volunteers, but 4 out of 5 were trained to do everything but fight. When casualties were higher than predicted, cooks, clerks, mechanics, and brand new conscripts had to be given crash weapons training. The results were murderous.
Some of my reinforcements. We captured an old college. There were 4 of us to a room, and this guy started cleaning a grenade, and he put in the detonator without realizing what he was doing. And 4 guys were killed instantly.
For the rest of the war, men with scant weapons training were sent into one of the most savage battles in history. They were almost always the first to die. This was a crucial time for the Canadian Army in Normandy. The Canadians around Caen were assigned to push the entrenched German army off the Verrières Ridge and clear the main road through Falaise to Paris. Allied Commander Bernard Montgomery was under enormous pressure from Prime Minister Winston Churchill for a breakout victory. The man of the hour was the Canadian general highly regarded by the British, Guy Simonds. Under heavy political pressure for that quick victory, Simonds was about to make some tragic mistakes.
Some visiting Russian army officers asked me, by how much did we outnumber the enemy? I said by 3 to 1. Well, they were greatly surprised. They said they wouldn't attack unless they outnumbered the Germans by at least 5 or 6 to 1.
Reducing the attack ratio from 5 or 6 to 1 down to 3 to 1 would further endanger the lives of every man in the Canadian attack. Another dangerous Simonds decision concerned one of the key members of his command team, General Rod Keller. Before the invasion of Normandy, the judgment on Keller from the Canadian Defence Headquarters was that he was incompetent to command a 20,000-man division. Keller was popular with his superiors because he was seen as tough and hard-drinking. He also had the right connections, and so he was now commanding those 20,000 men. After 30 days of intense battle, though, Keller was slowly going to pieces. On the 5th of July, 1944, British Army Lieutenant General John Crocker was asked to report on Keller's condition.
Keller is not fit temperamentally and perhaps physically for such a responsible command. He is a man who has the appearance of having lived pretty well. The general state of despondency of his division is a reflection of its commander, who is showing signs of fatigue and nervousness. One might almost say fright.
To his credit, General Keller suddenly asked to be removed from command for medical reasons. The resignation went to General Simonds.
I've decided to keep him. I'm about to launch a series of important attacks, and I feel the removal of Keller would sink the morale of his men even lower.
As a result, Rod Keller, a general who saw in the abyss his own weakness and tried to resign, was left in command as the crucial battle of Verrières Ridge was about to start. Simonds decided that the attack on a town called Tilly-la-Campagne should go in at night to keep casualties low. But here Simonds decided to improvise a new technique. He ordered searchlights to be bounced off the clouds to create what he called artificial moonlight. This was to be done without rehearsal or even properly briefing the men. As the attack was launched at 3:30 a.m. on July 25th, the improvised searchlight plan would result in sudden death for dozens of soldiers. During the attack, someone bungled and ordered the searchlights dropped to ground level, silhouetting the men to German fire.
Jesus Christ!
The Canadian regiments fought a pitched battle through the night, but the improvised planning proved disastrous for them. The machine guns of the highly trained German SS divisions decimated the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. In the aftermath of the battle, the Canadian dead littered the battlefield, but Canadian headquarters ordered the regiments to reform and attack again. The field commanders refused to follow the order. A Canadian brigadier came out to visit the battlefield, and these scenes convinced him that the attack must be called off. His name was Dan Cunningham.
I couldn't send them back against the SS. It would have been murder. I decided to go and see Keller and tell him it was all off.
We have no chance!
At Keller's headquarters, this was a key moment. Lives, careers, and the battle hung in the balance.
There has to be another way.
I have my orders, Brigadier, and you have your orders, sir.
It was a moment of desperation for General Keller. The British generals wanted his head, but Simmons had given him another chance. Now one of his brigadiers was demanding the key Verrier Ridge attack be given up.
He ordered me to attack again. I told him that would be murder. He said if I didn't attack again, we'd both lose our jobs. I told him I had a law position waiting for me back in Kingston. And I was not about to sacrifice my Highlanders to save his job.
In the assault on Tilly-la-Campagne, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders suffered grievous losses and then were blamed for the failure of the attack. After the battle, the military establishment closed ranks. General Keller was left in command of the division. A decision was made to blame more junior officers for the defeat, even though one man was ultimately responsible for the disastrous plan of attack, General Simmons.
I ordered a court of inquiry into Tilly-la-Campagne. I gave the okay to Keller to sack Cunningham, Petch of the North Novies, and Christensen.
Brigadier Cunningham was sent back to Canada. Courageously, he followed his conscience and was punished for it. The field officers who fought at Verrier Ridge admire the courage of commanders like Cunningham, commanders who know when it's time to stop.
There's got to be courage at a level higher than the unit. The courage to take the decision not to do a certain thing. Courage is not only taking your sword out, going over the parapet and bashing right and left and firing your gun and so on. The moral courage of standing on your 2 feet, assessing a situation and saying, no, this ain't on.
Down the ridge on that same day, another regiment, the Black Watch, would follow Simmons' orders in a similar situation and discover the deadly consequences. The Royal Highland Regiment of Montreal, known as the Black Watch, is one of the most famous and prestigious regiments in Canada. Its long and bloody history stretches back to 1862. Here, the members of today's Black Watch will relive one of the darkest days in the history of their regiment. In countless battles, the Black Watch has been chosen as the regiment to lead the Canadian attack, a tradition that was built on the central philosophy of this regiment. The Black Watch is honor-bound to never retreat. Never. In 1939, the Black Watch prepared for war with bayonet practice on the football field of McGill University in Montreal, where many were students. They wore kilts, but the volunteers came from many nationalities. The Scots and Irish were joined by Poles, Ukrainians, and lots of Americans. In London, they posed with their honorary colonel, the Queen of England. The watch symbolized the best young men Canada had to offer. One of those was Major Phil Griffin. The British Columbia native was doing his doctorate at McGill when war broke out. In England, Griffin took training very seriously. The men trusted him as a leader. Griffin became a favorite of soldiers like Bruce Duckett of Verdun, Quebec.
He looks like a young college boy, put it that way. A very smart, good-looking soldier. Oh, he can be tough as nails, but very fair.
The men of today's Black Watch know that the story of their regiment's darkest day is a combination of bad luck, poor generalship, and tragic miscalculation. In the early morning of July 25th, 1944, they were told to advance across an open field and clear the enemy out of a French village about a kilometer away. Their top general, Guy Simmons, watched them move out from his observation post overlooking the battlefield. This was the plan from his point of view. The Black Watch were to move through the villages of Saint-Martin and Saint-André, supposedly already in Canadian hands. From there, they would attack up the hill to capture the village of Fontenay, just over the crest of Verrières Ridge. On the right, overlooking the battlefield, was the town of May. The Black Watch were told it too was in Canadian hands. In fact, the Germans were there and everywhere. The entire ridge was honeycombed with mine shafts, allowing the Germans to move around the battlefield undetected. General Simmons' staff knew about the mine shafts, but didn't think it important enough to pass on to the Black Watch. In the version of this battle fed to war correspondents like Matthew Halton, Canada scored a great victory.
We got forward to Canadian units which had cleaned out Saint-André-sur-Orne and were attacking to take Verrières and May-sur-Orne. And as soon as we got into the battle, we saw tired, muddy, and excited Canadian soldiers coming back with German prisoners. Scores of prisoners. And we learned this today. If you show contempt for the German, they get demoralized. They were holding us up beyond Saint-André, so we decided to ignore the snipers and go on. And when the others saw us do that, they came out with white flags.
That account is about as far from the truth as you can get. Today, the battlefield looks much as it did in the hot summer of 1944.
This battle is called the Battle of Saint-André, but it really is all about crossing Verrières Ridge.
Canadian Staff College Colonel Roman Yaromowitz has analyzed the battle and discovered many details not known even by men who were fighting nearby.
So simply put, what they had to do was leave the town, advance across, get to their start line, really the crest of that ridge, and attack Fontenay-le-Marmillon. But things go wrong. The Germans are in the houses. They can't figure out why the Germans are there. All through here are mines. And what the Germans are doing is using these mine shafts to bring in reinforcements. So you can clean out a house once, and half an hour later, they've come back into the house. You're advancing, and suddenly you're taking fire from the side. Before they know it, they've lost 3-4 hours.
Across the battlefield, the Germans watched the Canadian approach.
The infantry at May alerted me that strong enemy elements had been observed north of St. Martin. The sky was sallow, Leichenlicht, dead man's light.
As the Canadians moved into position for the attack, German snipers hidden in the fields carefully took aim at the senior Canadian officers. An MG-42 machine gun like this killed the Black Watch colonel and severely wounded his second in command. Suddenly, the regiment was in the hands of the popular junior officer, 26-year-old Phil Griffin. The Canadians could not understand where the German fire was coming from. Their jump-off point was supposed to have been cleared of the enemy. As they moved towards the town of May on their flank, most of the Germans disappeared back down the mine shafts and popped up elsewhere on the battlefield. The Canadians assumed that the Germans had retreated from the town, but in fact, the remaining Germans were just hiding and holding their fire. General Simmons was watching from afar, impatient with the delays. One of his brigadiers was sent to get Griffin and the Black Watch moving. What was said at this meeting is still a matter of bitter controversy. The brigadier claims he told Griffin to be cautious and make sure the villages were clear before advancing up the ridge. The Black Watch has a very different version. They say the brigadier ordered them to stop wasting time with the villages and attack straight up the ridge. Whatever was said, the brigadier left the pressure square on the shoulders of a 26-year-old major and a battalion which never retreated.
He waits for the tanks, but they're late. He wants to have a squadron of tanks. They're supposed to come up to May to help him, but he can't wait any longer. So he deploys his battalion, roughly in this area. 2 companies forward. They say about 150, perhaps 200 yards wide. 2 companies up, 2 companies back. Over 325 men, the Black Watch. So on the command, realizing the tanks aren't going to be here on time, Phil Griffin says, "Black Watch, advance." He picks up his hand, falls at once, and points. The whole battalion stands up.
Okay, let's go! Move on!
And somewhere up there is a German who's watching him with field glasses and is maintaining a solid grip on his division, saying, "Hold your fire, we've got a battalion coming into our gun sights."
We noticed a body of infantry, about 300 to 400 men, advanced south. This was most impressive and perplexing. The soldiers were marching upright, holding rifles against their breasts in readiness, as if on parade drill. Despite strong fire from our forces in May, scarcely anybody looked for cover. It looked like waves of men rolling steadily forward. No sign of panic despite their visible losses.
There was no panic, but a growing desperation as Major Griffin tried to get the artillery to fire and cover his advance. But the radio malfunctioned. The Black Watch were all alone, and all alone, whole platoons began to die.
Text Richard, an American buddy in the watch. He's right beside me when a shell blows him up. He says, "Ducky, come help me." I says, "I can't, but I'll be back, Tex, sure as hell."
they did not go for cover, but kept on marching upright. To us, soldiers with 4 or 5 years of experience in Russia, this was an almost unreal sight.
And the men are advancing. At one point, someone yells at Griffin saying, "We can't go on, it's murder to go on." And Griffin says, "Well, it's murder to stay here. Let's keep going on to the left." And he keeps on advancing with the men.
Griffin and a band of desperate soldiers actually reached the top of the ridge.
We believe at one point in the battle, just as Griffin and roughly about 60 men crossed that crest line. That's all we think ever made it. At that point, a runner comes up to Griffin and says, "They're coming. Support company is coming." And these, as far as we know, are Griffin's last words. He tells his runner, he says, "Get back and tell them to send no more reinforcements. We've got too many men as it is, we're trapped. Send no more reinforcements."
The attack faded out, as actually there was nobody left over. It had been, well, sheer butchery.
Corporal Duckett marched at Griffin's side until he was felled by a German shell.
The Black Watch. We never learned the word retreat. And I didn't want to be branded a coward. I didn't want to bring disgrace on my family, on my regiment.
The last picture I remember is a few Canadian soldiers, mostly wounded, trying to get north. You should know, we did not fire on the retreating men. We had been too deeply impressed and embarrassed by this sacrifice and gallantry of a battalion which had no chance against our position, no close air support, and meager artillery. I think the dominating feeling was, let these poor men get home safely.
And they found a string of bodies, still wearing their kit, still close to their weapons, strung all the way out from their form-up point there, right up to that crest line. And beyond that, just past our line of vision, they found the body of Major Griffin, surrounded with about 15 to 20 men. The rest of others have been taken away. And this ridge is basically the end of the Black Watch, or at least the Black Watch for that battle. They lost well over 300 men. Of the 320 that crossed their original start line, only 15 came back to be counted.
For Canada, the Battle of Verrières Ridge is second only to Dieppe as a catastrophe in the Second World War. Few Canadians have ever heard about it because the full extent of the calamity was covered up. The families of the soldiers slaughtered here were told only that their boy, their brother, their lover, their husband died doing his duty on the 25th of July, 1944. All told, from Tilly on the left to Saint-André on the right. There were 450 dead and 1,500 wounded, many maimed for life in body or in mind. Late in the day, facing rebellion, General Simmons finally stopped sending more men.
I went to see Monty, and I told him I was calling off all further operations. It was not a good day. I decided against visiting the field hospitals to boost morale. It would have destroyed mine.
Before the battle, the men of the Black Watch were told it was going to be a glorious breakout to surround the Germans. After the slaughter, General Simmons declared it was actually planned as a sacrifice action for the Allied cause. The survivors are still bitter about that dark day. They especially resent the attempt by Simmons and the Army to lay the blame for the regiment's death at the grave of young Phil Griffin. The Army did not honor him with a medal. The epitaph comes from his family. The top reads, "That they might have life." The bottom reflects the family's defiant pride, and all the trumpets sounded for him on the other side. Canada's first attempt to push the Germans off Verrières Ridge ended in disaster. But officers like Jacques Dextraz and Radley Walters and their men found astonishing ways to turn the tide of battle and find the path to victory in the fields of Normandy in the late summer of 1944. In August of 1944, the Allies were far behind schedule in the battle for Normandy. The Canadian Army was still stalled around the French villages on the low ground below Verrières Ridge. Firmly ensconced on the high ground of the ridge were the crack panzer divisions of the German Army. It would take skill and courage to push them off. The tide began to turn at battles like the one for this church. The Germans were hanging on here with machine guns firing down from the steeple. The ancient walls formed an immense barrier to infantry assault, and the Canadians had been thrown back in repeated attempts to storm it.
Well, you know, this bloody wall goes up here.
Jacques Dextraz was going out on leave one night when he heard there was to be another attack on the church. Dextraz was the type that often thought he had a better plan than his superiors, and on that night, his free advice cost him a good meal.
Well, I was going out for dinner with a couple of the boys that night. Chicken, a couple of bottles of wine, and that was to be our evening, when I heard the battalion was to be committed at Saint-Martin-Fontenay. Went to brigade, listened to the orders, and suggested that the attack might be better done in another manner. Promptly, CO turned to me and said, "Jim, would you come down to the unit and do the battle?" So, boy, I should have kept my mouth shut maybe, eh? So anyway, I reported to the unit, made a quick reconnaissance from the top of that farmhouse over there, noticed that the plan that had been evolved before I joined the unit wasn't feasible. Noticed a breach on the left flank. I said, that's the way to go in.
A breach is a hole in the wall?
A breach was a hole in the church wall. Burst into the breach and the wall. Man this side, each with machine gun. The third section started running for the door. We were firing as we were going from the hip. We got to the church, and the third section got in there, and then we threw grenades in, used our machine guns, firing left, firing right.
The surprise assault worked. Dextraz chased the Germans out the back door, but he knew they would rally and be back within minutes for a ferocious counterattack.
Because we were throwing grenades at them and firing machine guns.
Dextraz and his men, though, had one more surprise ready.
Well, We took a quick survey of the church, what it looked like, and I told them that they should place themselves in these windows, away from the floor, because the counterattack would come from probably that corner, and they would be really raking the floor level with machine gun fire as they'd come in and throwing grenades.
The church was counterattacked just as expected, and the Germans driven off. It turned out to be a critical battle for control of this part of the countryside, and it won Dextraz the Distinguished Service Order.
Did you feel in awe or superstitious about breaking into a church, destroying it, throwing grenades?
No, not at all. The relationship between my God and I was very intimate, you know, and I knew that my friend would understand what I was doing, you know. The Germans were in here. They had no business being there. They were in the way. They had to be getting the hell out of it, and I think he understood. I had faith. It pulled me through the war. Oh, I didn't go down on my knees every minute and every day, but there was a little prayer that I used to say, and that was the only one. That prayer was, "Thy will be done." That's all. And a great peace came over me because, you know, you're in front of death there, and you have to be honest with yourself. And when you say that little prayer, you have to mean it. You can't fake it. It's you and your God, you see, that's there. So that pulled me through.
Under fire, each man searched for his own way through the horror. Donald Pierce felt differently about God.
When we were shelled, I watched others praying, and I felt sorry for them. I thought only a weak-minded person could drag theology into this stark and meaningless place. And so, instead of taking God's name into my heart, I took it in vain. Again and again. Silently. Though others may have thought me praying.
The Normandy War Museum celebrates the Allied victory, but inside you wonder how they won when you see the small Allied Sherman tank right beside the large and powerful German Panther.
Old Panther, a German Mark V. The sides of the
Canadian tank officer Radley Walters once watched a lineup of 3 Canadian tanks killed with one shot from the Panther's 75mm gun. At first, the Panther seemed invulnerable, but before long, the best Canadian tank killers figured a way to stop it. All it took was what seems like a 1 in a million shot.
If you hit on this big, heavy gun mounted, and here's a pretty good example over here, where somebody's hit it, and what happens? It just bounces off. But now look over the armor on the driver and on your side, the co-driver, and just see how thin it is in here. Now, if you can get around to come on in and hit on the lower side of this gun mantle from here right over there, which gives you a target of about 4 or 5 feet wide, and from there down to here. The round cannot bounce off, it must bounce down. And when it bounces down, what does it do? It smashes this weak armor here over the driver and the co-driver, and in most cases, we found out that they're either badly wounded or they're killed, and the tank is automatically knocked out.
Pretty small target to hit.
It is, and, you know, the longer the distance and so on, but if you can get your second round, if you can't get your first one, your second round in from here down to the bottom, we found out that you could destroy a Panther
with a 75 millimeter at up to 800-900 yards, head on.
Staff college instructors still find it astonishing.
Wait a minute, General Rad. A 6-inch bullseye at 800 yards with your first shot?
Sure, why not?
19 German tanks were knocked out by Radley Walters, the best kill record of any Canadian. Later in Normandy, the Allies found less risky ways of killing German tanks. This plane, the Typhoon, was the answer to many a general's prayer. Its principal mission was to hunt German Panther and Tiger tanks and kill them with rockets. This Canadian Typhoon squadron was one of several used by the Allies to counter the overwhelming superiority of the German panzers. The establishing of air superiority, combined with other new techniques of destroying the German armored divisions, led to the destruction of the German Army of the West and the end of Hitler's last hope of finishing the war with a negotiated settlement. To some who witnessed it, the massing of Allied military power and the violent spectacle of its performance against the enemy can be compared to the performance of an orchestra.
We've got artillery, medium, light, we've got aircrafts coming in, we've got typhoons. You know, it's a whole symphony, this whole thing. You go to the theater and you listen to the music that's being played. If you listen only to a trumpet, that doesn't give you much. But it's everything together that really makes this opera or this symphony meaningful to you. You can rest in your chair and you can listen to it and you say, oh, that's something. We were good with all the weaponry that we had. Some were less good than the ones he had. Maybe in some cases our tactics were a hell of a lot better than his. We believed that we had the guns to support the armament, the aircrafts, the artillery pieces, and our guts, apart from that, and our ability to want to do the thing. And we did it.
With every day that passed in Normandy, the Allies built up more and more firepower. The Germans often displayed superior fighting ability, but eventually the Canadians used heavy bombing and relentless assaults to push Kirkmeyer's Hitler Youth Division off Verrières Ridge.
Had made a cemetery out of my front line. What I see now is no longer war, but naked murder. My young grenadiers, the oldest barely 18, they have not yet learned how to live. But God knows they have learned how to die.
There is a lot of controversy about whether Canadians won their battles because of their generalship or in spite of it. Many criticized the Canadian commanders for being careless when caution was required, then being indecisive in situations demanding boldness. General Simmons never answered his critics.
We won a victory, but at a great cost. Unlike the British or the Americans, we were continuously engaged and took a higher proportion of dead and wounded. Our divisions in Normandy suffered 18,444 casualties, 5,021 killed.
General Simmons was highly decorated for his role in the war. He won the Distinguished Service Order and became a companion of the Order of the British Empire. Kurt Meyer was captured and passed over to Canada for a war crimes trial. He was found guilty of complicity in the murder of Canadian prisoners by soldiers under his command. In the end, though, even the judge presiding over the military court was relieved when Meyer's death sentence was commuted. Brigadier Harry Foster.
I don't believe Meyer pulled the trigger on his captives or gave orders to execute any of them. But I'm sure he knew what was happening. But does that make him any more guilty of murder than I'm guilty for knowing about the German prisoners my troops killed?
Many of those soldiers who joined the Canadian Army only to get a steady paycheck in the midst of the Great Depression felt very differently about their mission at the end of the war. The North Shore Regiment's Joseph Le Boutillier discovered his patriotism in the fields of Normandy.
I'm proud. An Acadian who fought for Canada. We stopped the Germans from taking over the world.
Because now you're learning the tricks of the trade from experience. The first time I did that...
Radley Walters went on to become one of Canada's top generals. When he tries to pass along the lessons of Normandy to today's soldiers, he emphasizes that patriotism is not enough to keep a man going through the horror of war.
And I think what I learned was an awful lot about ourselves. And what I found out is that not necessarily you fight for king or queen or even country, but I found out that there's a whole bunch of friends out there, chums, and people that you had joined up with, people who you trained with, and people who you loved, really. And therefore, when the chips are down, nobody but nobody was going to leave the other guy down.
Canadian soldiers who watched their best friends die carry their own heavy burden of the memory of that battle. Donald Pierce was haunted by the ancient epitaph of Roman warriors.
Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. How sweet and good it is to die for one's country. I think of those I knew, now dead. There was something sweet about their death, and glorious. We must all go at last, and they went, followed by men who labored with them and loved them. All this a civilian can never know.
Every Canadian, whoever comes to France, should just walk up there and spend a minute by himself and realize that the number of Canadians that died on that hill was just exceptional, and their bravery in trying to get there and maintain the pressure was just beyond anything one can imagine.
Fervent chrétien, fier et brave soldat, repose dans la paix du Seigneur. 16 years old, a child. Well, son, we owe you a lot.
In this cemetery beside Verrier Ridge are buried 2,793 Canadians. Some are in unmarked graves, many have no epitaph, and the sacrifice of all of them is too often forgotten in their homeland. The poet Houseman wrote, "Here dead we lie because we did not choose to shame the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young."